Welcome, everyone, to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley. And with me today, I'm so excited to have my guest, Edla Prevette. How are you today, Edla? It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thanks, Desiree. I'm great. How are you?
Doing very well. Edla is a licensed clinical mental health counselor, and you work specifically with coaching around aging parents. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about. And so I think that this is what I'm beginning to encounter as, I am aging, my mother is aging, my kids, and I'm kind of in the middle, and we'll talk about what that's called. But this is going to be our topic today, and you're the expert. So, firstly, I want to know, how was it that you became a licensed clinical mental health counselor? What kind of directed you to, follow that path? And then what was it specifically about helping people with the aging parents and how to handle that kind of situation?
Okay. Well, early in my career, I was a classroom teacher, and then I went back to school and I was a school counselor. So early in my career, I worked primarily with children, um, and then started my private practice. And I continued to do work with children, but I also worked in the school system as a parent counselor. So parents would come in, their 2-year-old wouldn't sleep through the night, their 3-year-olds were tantruming, that sort of thing. And so I would work with them on some, parenting skills to help with some of those kinds of things. And I also had my private practice where I was seeing children, but then the parents started wanting to come see me about their own mental health issues or their unresolved childhood trauma. So I was kind of moving in that direction. But when I was a parent counselor at the school system was when my father's health started to decline. My mother was calling me all the time about things that my dad would or wouldn't do. And I'm trying to work full time and I'm trying to deal with my mother's phone calls. And I just remember one day she had called me about something that he wouldn't do. And just this light bulb went off. And I thought, wow, the things that I'm teaching my parents of young children, hmm, I think some of this might work for my dad. And not in a condescending way, but just in a way that made him feel more empowered, that made him feel in more control. So I began to use some of the principles that I did at work with my parents. Then I started thinking I'm onto something. You start looking around and there's nothing out there. I started doing my own research and I started talking to everyone. And then my parents continued to age and I became more responsible for their care. Simultaneously, my private practice was moving to more adults who were now starting to complain, I think to say it, and worried about their parents. So after my dad passed in 2014, and then I was a caretaker for my mother, and she passed in 2021. And it's, even prior to her passing, I had started doing some more specific work with adult children around their aging parents. And then I just remember one day, I don't know, a couple of years ago, I was on a walk and I was listening to a podcast and they were like, what is your why? What is your purpose? That kind of thing. And I was like, I want to get some of this stuff together and put it out into the world so more people understand how to make the last years of their parents' lives, or it could be even the last 30 years of their parents' lives, just go a little bit better. And you can find a lot about making a will or getting different kinds of, like retirement communities and things like that. But there wasn't very much about how to just deal with the day to day challenges and the day to day decisions and kind of when you have to start parenting your parents. And it really starts a lot earlier than when they fall and break their hip or they get in a car accident. There's a lot that goes on much earlier than that. And so I think prevention is a big deal and understanding what's going on is so important. And well, I could go on, but that gives you the idea.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And, it makes perfect sense that you're seeing a need and it kind of is not forcing you, but kind of directing you to follow that path. So that makes sense. And, it is really something that a lot of us don't want to think about necessarily. And that's what do we do with our parents when they begin aging? And I'm so glad you brought up the point about starting earlier than you think you need to. And, we can talk about that a little bit more if you'd like. But there was so much goodness in what you just shared. I think let's start with this first. What is a sandwich generation? And I think, you kind of did a little bit of a description of what that is, but let's specifically address it. And then let's talk about what the people who are in that position are worrying about or concerned or feeling maybe overwhelmed about.
So the sandwich generation is basically when, as an adult child, your parents are still living and you have to care for them, but then your children are still at home. So that could be, some people don't have their children until a little bit later. And so, you could have a 9-year-old at home, you could be 45 and you could have an 80-year-old parent, right? And then there's so many statistics, and what most people know is that people are living so much longer. Now that sandwich is getting thicker in the middle because there's adults that are taking care of their parents. Their adult children are having children. So they're sandwiched between their parents, their adult children, and their grandchildren. If people start living to over 100 more and more and more, which I think is on the horizon, then this is going to be even more of a issue and something that's going to be challenging.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure because a lot of us waited longer to have our own children. And so I can see how then it's not just your parent and your child, but also, grandchildren as a possibility as well. So, yeah, thank you for going into a little bit more detail there. And so, what do you think that you can share with the listeners who are finding themselves in this position that maybe a few things that would help alleviate their concern about how they can communicate with their parents. Like you mentioned, your mom is calling you, telling you your dad is not doing this or that, and maybe they're experiencing that now. What can you share with the listeners about that, like to help address that concern?
Well, I think so many things, but I think what I'd like to do first is tell you sort of what the complaints are,
Mm.
because then I think that from there we can lead into it. It might help the listeners understand what I'm talking about, especially when I'm talking about catching it early. So, generally, when people end up, calling me or coming to see me, they're definitely frustrated or worried, typically. We'll go with those two feelings, right? And usually I say, tell me about what's going on, what are your questions, so forth and so on. And there's generally four topics or four themes. One, they'll say, I don't know, they're acting like teenagers. That's one that they say. And then I, inquire more. And then the second one, they go, it feels like I'm dealing with a toddler. And then I ask more about that. The third is they're just not making good choices. I'm worried about their safety. And then I would say the fourth one would be, they don't have a plan. They won't even talk about this with me. That's where the transition starts, right? Is when the adult children begin to see their parents behaving differently. And they see it as generally a safety issue, physical safety, financial safety, emotional safety, it's all of it. So circle back to your question. First of all, by having some understanding of why they're doing those things, I think is important, which is, I always say we read about what to expect the first year, or you read about a 2-year-old, but nobody reads about development across the lifespan, which I think is a mistake. We really need to read about development of the aging population. What are some sort of typical things? Because sometimes education and that knowledge gives you a little bit of empathy for them. It might still be aggravating, but it's normal. So when they're acting like teenagers, if you've ever been around a teenager, it's aggravating, but it's also typical, right? So understanding some of that, I think, is really important. And then just thinking about, okay, if they're making decisions that aren't safe, I can't you can try to tell them, Dad, you need to quit driving. That hardly ever works,
Yeah.
right? So then it's about if there's something that you're concerned about, it's like, how do we talk to them in such a way that we can at least have the conversation or elicit cooperation with them?
Oh, yeah. No, that's a great starting point, I think, really. And there's a couple of things in there that you said that I want to talk about because we see so much of the financial situations that the aging parents, unfortunately, they get taken advantage of in so many instances just because, these schemes have become so complicated that they don't realize what is happening and they can be taken advantage of. And I think we see that a lot, unfortunately. And so this, of course, is a huge concern for adult children
Right.
who are seeing this for sure. And then, of course, not just the falling and that sort of thing, but like you said, the driving, maybe it's not something they should be doing anymore. So you kind of touched on how to talk to your, aging parent? Like, how do you address them in a way that they're not feeling like you're telling them what to do, which we know doesn't work with children and teenagers and adults as well, and especially when you're their child,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, so it's sort of tiers, right? If you talk about having a conversation with your parents about not driving anymore, I mean, there's a lot of factors that you have to consider because that's a big one. But if you're talking about things like, I'm trying to think of an example of not letting you help them with grocery shopping or not letting you order them groceries or saying things like, I've always done it this way and it's been fine, or the amount of stuff that is spoiled in the refrigerator or expired, which is such a common thing. So there's sort of tiers of things that you can have discussion with them about. I think one of the big things that troubles, a lot of adult children, they'll just like, if I don't hear from them, I'm assuming everything's okay, right? But then the phone starts ringing and they're calling you about something. I can't get my computer to work. And you're like, the passwords are attached to the computer, mom, or they're in the book right beside the computer. And you're getting frustrated with them. And they're like, don't talk to me, dad, or I can't find them. And then it's just, you like two children, right? Sort of going
Mhm.
back and forth at each other. So handling those kinds of day-to-day tasks like that are a little, I get easier maybe than some of the big things like you need to quit driving or we need to look into an assisted living situations. We can kind of dive into those.
Yeah, well, let's do that. Let's talk a little bit about maybe how you can communicate with them. Like, what are perhaps a couple of things that you can use to bridge that gap where you don't wanna start a fight, you don't want it to become a huge issue, but these things need to be communicated.
Right. So there's a technique that I just call it the bookend technique. And I generally will advise my clients to use this when their parents approach them with an emotional response. Pick a topic, right? They call, and I'm thinking about the holiday season coming up, and it's like, I want to put Halloween decorations out, but I can't get in the attic, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, Mom, I'm working. I've got all this stuff to do. I can't come get your Halloween decorations out of the attic, right? So instead of responding like that, if they come at you with an emotional kind of attack, if you will, it could be crying, it could be whining, it could be bossing you around, anything like that. You want to use this bookend technique because what you need to do is to regulate them a little bit. They're not emotionally regulated. So if you can bring down the energy, the emotional energy, then you can have a better chance of getting them to cooperate. So I have this bookend technique and I call it a bookend technique. It just sort of came to me because if you don't have the two bookends, what happens to the books? They fall over, right? So if you just launch into, don't call me at work, I've got all this stuff to do. That's like getting no bookends there. And then it's going to be an argument. So what you want to do is when you get attacked by them or they're calling about some sort of complaint, the first thing that you want to do is to use empathic listening. That's the first thing you want to do because you've got to bring the energy down. So that might sound something like, wow, dad, you're really aggravated, or wow, mom, you're really frustrated. Pick a feeling, you can probably tell you're really worried about. You really wish I could come get the Halloween decorations right now, or you really hope that you can do this. You're really frustrated that you can't do that sort of thing. That's that first bookend. That's first step. And what happens when you do that, they feel heard and they feel understood. So it brings that emotional energy down. Then you can do the middle part two. Then you can begin to problem solve. I can't do that right now, but I've got some time this weekend. What would be helpful? Or what do you think we can do about it? And see if they can then generate some ideas. But they're not going to be able to problem solve or brainstorm or be cooperative until that emotional energy is down, right? And then the last part, the third step is a lot of people, no matter who I teach this to, they leave this part off, and that's like wrapping it up. That's like, that was really hard for you, but we were able to come up with a solution to that problem. I know you really wish that you could do that, but you were able to figure something else out. It's
Yeah.
just that encouragement and that support. And sometimes it goes just about as quick as I just said it to you. Sometimes, you have to do a little more empathic nodding and sighing and then sometimes you have to circle back around to it. And sometimes when they get calm and you say something like, well, that was really hard for you, mom, they'll be like, don't talk to me like I'm a child. And you're like, okay, okay. And then you just laugh and you go on about your business. But that works so well. Just those three things. Now, I will say I've been doing it a long time, so it's pretty natural for me. But when you start talking to other people like that, it feels a little artificial, at first, because you have to find your style and your voice. But as long as you're sort of that empathic listening, that reflecting their feelings, and get that energy down before you start problem solving and asking them if they've got some ideas is a great start because especially with adults, because they feel autonomy and or your parents, they feel that autonomy and that sense of control, which they've been around a while. They don't want to lose that. And then finally, the kind of wrapping it up with support. And, so there you go. That's how that works. But it takes a
Yeah.
little while to get used to it.
For sure. No, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And I 100% agree. You can't meet that, frustration or anger or, whatever with that same level because that's just going to be all bad. And
Right.
so, yeah, for sure, it's not necessarily how we react right now. So it's going to take practice. Totally makes sense. And what a difference it can make if you can just take a deep breath yourself and reflect, like you said, what the feeling is that they're having, the emotion that they're having. And I love that you said about asking them for suggestions because you're totally right. Like these people have been in charge of their lives for, just about 80 years or whatever the number may be.
Mm,
And they're used to being in control. And so
right.
if you're going to take that away, that's going to cause a whole nother set of problems. So I can see that 100%. Having them share what they think might work is going to be a great way to keep them feeling like they're still in charge.
Right.
So that's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
I think when truthfully it works for anybody, it works with your partner, works with your kids, works with your coworkers. I mean, it's just a good strategy to use in general. I did want to say something you had mentioned when you were just talking about, if they're 80 years in, they have all this sense of power and control. It's funny when I talk about aging parents, I don't often use their age.
Mm,
And the reason for that is because just like children, they progress and develop so differently. So we'll use 80. We'll start there. You can line up 10 80-year-olds and they have such different skills, such different abilities. Their aging is completely different. You can line up 10 60-year-olds. You know, I have a woman that I'm working with right now. She's 33 and her parents are 68, but she's already beginning to see some changes, right? Now they're very independent and all that, but they're already butting heads about some things because she thinks one of her parents, she thinks they should be doing some things differently. I have to always remind myself that, you know, some of the listeners might be thinking, oh, well, my parents aren't really aging, but it's all relative. So for whatever that's worth.
No, great point. I'm glad you brought that up because you're absolutely right. Not just mentally and or physically, an 80-year-old from one to the other could be entirely different. Their life experiences, their health condition, their physical condition, all of that, it plays a huge part in their abilities in general and what they're capable of doing. So it could be a 60-year-old that is, having these experiences that are really difficult and relatively young, we would say today. And so you're absolutely right. It doesn't necessarily have to be that they are, 70, 80, 90 for there to be this need.
And I think you made another good point when you were talking, which I hadn't really thought to bring up, but their life experience. We've got all these, Vietnam vets and all the baby boomers, and their life experience is so different. And then you look at regions and you look at people that come from their socioeconomic background, and all of those things factor in. I think about a client, Asian American client. She was raised here, but her family was not. And so the cultural differences, and she's trying to get her parents to do some things differently, but culturally, their life experience is just so different. And so then there's just a different kind of clash because she was raised here. There-
For sure. Totally another good point there. That's another factor that influences, how you're relating to your parents. Completely makes sense. So then let's talk a little bit about something that you share a lot, and that's 4 tips for avoiding that kind of power struggle or, this is how I've always done it, kind of thing like you mentioned earlier. What are some tips that you can share that can minimize that or keep that from happening?
So the power struggles overlap a little bit with the bookend technique. There's some of the parts of it that are similar, but the difference in a power struggle is usually the adult child has a big emotional response, whether it be they have an agenda, they disagree with their parents, they're just so over them or so worm, and then the parent is also, right? So in the bookend technique, that's working under the assumption that the adult child is calm, right? And they're trying to calm their parents down. In the power struggle, that's when both people have some sort of emotional component to it, right? And so disagreeing is okay, but if it's the underpinning has an emotional piece to it, then the disagreement and the problem solving just doesn't happen as well. So I just remember it. I remember Clip, just my mnemonic device to remember it. But the C is for composure, and that's your composure. That's your personal composure. If you go into a conversation with your parents about not driving or moving to a retirement community or pick a thing, if you go into it without being emotionally regulated yourself, you're already 3 steps behind, right? So it's really important for you to do some strategies for yourself to make sure that you have personal composure. My dad was challenging, but in a different way from my mother. My mother had a lot of opinions all the way to the end, and she just had her way of doing things, and she wanted it to be done, and she was very quick to tell me, I want to do this and this and this and this and this. And so it was just this barrage every time I went to see her. And she lived in an independent living apartment. So literally every time I went to see her, even if I didn't know there was going to be anything going on, because there probably was going to be something, I would sit in the parking lot for about 2 minutes and almost like I was in a locker room trying to like gear myself up. Right. So I'd be sitting there going, okay, you've got this. She doesn't have any control over her life. Just take some deep breaths, listen to what she's got to say, And so I was like, just getting myself calmed down enough so that I went in because I never knew. I mean, I never knew what it was going to be. I mean, it could be they served her food in styrofoam. I mean, I never knew. It was baffling on a daily basis. So that's the first thing is you've really got to have your own personal composure. And I encourage people, you've got to have your village through this process. My sister was mine. I would be like, oh my God, you're not going to believe what she said today. Or, your therapist or your spouse or whoever to sort of help you just get some personal composure. So that's huge. And depending on your relationship with your parents, and then all the history, right, which won't even touch on all the many years that you've been their child. Getting that personal composure is key to avoid these power struggles. And then I think the second thing is really whatever you need to tell them about or you're trying to get them to do or them you is to really listen to what they're saying. Because oftentimes we feel attacked. That's why the personal composure is so important, so that almost like it puts a shield up for you so that you can hear what they're saying and you can look almost past the words, right? Like listen past the words, past what they're actually saying, but say, what is the fear? What is the concern? What is the worry? I don't know. When you do that, it's a little easier to give people, I don't know, grace or the benefit of the doubt or whatever. So I think that the second one would be listening. And then the third one, I is inquire. Tell me more about that. Those open ended questions. Let them get it off of their chest. What else could you do? What do you think about that? Tell me more about instead of because what we want to do is just start problem solving it. It's just styrofoam, mom. Don't worry about the styrofoam. Just dump it in a plate and eat it or not. You just want to fix it. So I think inquiring. And then the last thing is just praising them. This is really hard, but you've got this and I'm going to help you. Again, it comes back to that feeling understood, feeling like somebody's listening to them, feeling like they're have some sense of control, feeling not so lonely, because that's another thing, their world often shrinks so much because when they retire, when they're not mobile as much, or when they just don't have the social network, their world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So, I mean, I teach a whole class on this, but I mean, I think for the sake of a podcast, this will give the listeners some ideas about things they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. What you just shared, clip, I love that. What a great way to remember those things at like a moment's notice.
Right.
It's just super easy to remember and how important the composure again, you've got to get yourself ready
Yeah.
and, bring yourself into balance, if you will, and prepare, listen, right? And again, these things can work for everybody, as you pointed out, your children, your teenagers, your coworkers, your spouse. Love it. So thank you again for sharing that.
Another little quick trick about the personal composure. So sometimes you can go into it and you feel like, okay, I've got this. And then you get in there and you're like, oh God, I don't have this. Right. So I tell my clients, I'm like, just go to the bathroom and just give yourself a minute or just go, hold on, I'm going to take this call or just go, let me go get some water, that sort of thing. The other tip that I have is kind of when you visit your parents, if you're in close proximity to them, and you kind of sit where you can see a clock or you can see your watch, and kind of like if you come in at 9, kind of watch when it goes south. And what I mean by that is when it starts, it's not going well. So, like for my mother, it was about an hour and a half. After about an hour and a half, it was like, okay, time for me to go or time for me to do something different because now we're going to start getting into it. And for some people, you can go all day. And some people, it might be 30 minutes. But it's okay to give yourself, to make a phone call or to go to the bathroom or go fix something to drink just to give yourself that little bit of composure or that
Mm.
little bit of a break or limit the amounts of times that you see them just to avoid some of it.
Those are great tips. Really fantastic. Thank you for sharing those too, because
Or
that's such a good point. You can take that time, like you just shared great things. I need to grab a water. I need to take this call real quick, but it gives you that opportunity to just take a step back and then get ready to come back again. And so I love that for sure. Great tips. And I want to talk about something else that we haven't touched on yet, and that's some of the sensory
oh,
issues that some aging adults can be experiencing. And so talk with us about that and like how would you help address those things and handle those types of things that are happening?
well, I think that I love talking about this, so I'm so glad that you brought it up because a lot of people, if they have children, they may have heard of sensory integration issues and kids that have some sensory processing issues. And not necessarily that aging people have it in the same way, but there's definitely changes in the senses with age. And so I didn't know a lot of this early on, but the thing that I noticed first that started making me curious about this, it was with my dad, and he started eating things differently, and
Mm.
I was so confused about that. And then my mom, who'd never done this before, I mean, she was all about some ice cream. Well, when I started educating myself, and I'm not an OT and, I'm not a medical professional like that, but the taste buds start to change with age. And so you're seeking something that you can actually taste, and the sweet and the salt is what you can taste it the most, right? So they begin to choose things like that that give them that more sensory satisfaction. So as their child, you're like, what are you doing? Eating biscuits, or eating ice cream all day or whatever. Well, it's because we don't understand that they can't taste it. And so actually I have a blog on my website about that very topic. So then what you have to do is get creative about using herbs and spices that have more flavor to them, things
Mm.
like that. And then what they'll say to you is like, I'm old, I can eat whatever I want. Maybe don't feel that. Maybe that's the thing you say. They're right. If they want to eat ice cream, so that's where it can go with that. And like hearing, when their hearing starts to change, it impacts their cognition. Then they might mishear something that you've said and they'll fake it for a long time because it doesn't happen just not usually. The sensory stuff doesn't change just overnight. There's subtle changes. I think the biggest thing to do about that is you really have to educate yourself. There's not a lot you can do about someone's vision or hearing or taste buds, but if you educate yourself about it and you understand what's happening, then it doesn't have to be conflict. You can adapt. My mother-in-law, for example, her hearing's just gotten worse and worse and worse with age. And, how you sometimes will talk to somebody, you might be looking the other direction or you walk into the other room while you're talking to them. Well, we can't do that to her. You have to speak up a little bit, but you have to be where she can see your face. Now, that just sounds like anybody would do that, right? But what if the parents coming back, I can't hear you. Why are you walking away? And they're yelling at you, then you feel like, quit yelling at me. And it's not really about that. It's about they're embarrassed that they can't hear, or they're frustrated, or they're worried, and then they yell, and then you become defensive, and then you're arguing about something that can't be helped, right?
Yeah.
So,
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that because you're absolutely right. I do see in my family situation, the taste changing for parents. I see the hearing, loss coming, and you can't make somebody do something they don't want to do, right? And so, how do you work around that? And find a way that they can still feel like they are making that decision themselves, but in a way that hopefully is satisfactory for both parties, that you're being considerate and
right.
talking at them face forward so they can not just hear but see, because that becomes such a part of the listening, right, is lip movement. And we can be considerate in that way and helping them
Mhm.
get through that transition that they're going through by just having some compassion. So yeah.
Yeah, right. But another thing is the touch. Their
Mm,
skin, the skin
mhm,
gets thinner and more sensitive. So a lot of times when they aren't bathing, or I remember my mom going, that pressure cuff is too tight. She was just like complaining about the blood pressure cuff. Well, it's because her skin, it's thinning, and so the water doesn't feel as good. It's too hot or it's too cold or the touch. And I thought she was just being ornery, but it it really was hurting her. And so just being mindful, but it's really that stuff is really about education, just educating yourself about what the sensory changes are as people age.
yeah, great point. Thank you for sharing that. And honestly, the blood pressure cuff is too tight for me half the time. So I can imagine as you are aging and as you said, your skin is getting thinner, but you're losing muscle and you're just not as strong as you were. And so of course that's going to be painful. I can completely appreciate that. So thank you for sharing that. Well, I want to talk about you mentioned your blog, and I'd love for you to share your website and where people can find that. But I think also you've got a workbook that you share with people. And so I'd love for you to talk about that if you would.
Right. So everything's on my website, Edla Prom, and I guess you'll put that in the show notes so they'll know how to spell it. And on there, on the front, you'll see at the top it says free 180 workbook. And I call a lot of my programs and my products, I call them all 180 because it's like we've done a 180. You were the child and now you're sort of the parent. But there is a workbook that talks specifically about the bookend technique. It gives more information than I gave today, but then it gives examples, and then it gives like scripts where you can actually fill in some things. So that is
Mhm.
just downloadable. You can get that. I also, I'm not sure when this is going to be aired, but I'm getting ready to do a workshop about home for the holidays, how to sort of prepare yourself for some of the stressors of the holidays with your parents. I do one-on-one coaching, of course. I have a group program in the works that's going to be kicking off in early 2024. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think it'll be a great community. Yeah, and I'm on social media. So I think that's everything. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. And definitely, I will include all of the website and your social handles in the show notes for sure so people can find that easily. And Edla, I love asking my guests what books they like to recommend that have been influential or beneficial to them that you think, maybe the listeners should check out.
I mean, this might not be for everyone because it's written by a Franciscan priest, but it's called The Wisdom Pattern. And I love it so much because he talks about Rohr is his last name, Rohr, I think. He talks a lot about in nature and in our lives that there is a period of order, disorder, and I love that so much because in these periods of disorder, there's this discourse and we hate it so much. But sometimes that's what has to happen to get us to reorder. And so I think that's a really fascinating idea to think about in nature with our relationships, whether they be our parents or our spiritual life or whatever, work life. I think in understanding that that's just sort of a natural progression, I think that's really insightful and really helpful.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that, and I'll
Yeah.
include that for sure. And then you mentioned listening to podcasts. So is there a podcast that you'd like to share?
I'm a governor, so I listen to Sharon McMahon's podcast. This is where it gets interesting. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I like Britt Morin's First in Line also.
Thank you for sharing those.
Yeah.
I'll put those in there as well so the listeners can check them out.
Yeah.
Edla, thank you again for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge with us. This information has been tremendous, and you've given us such great tips and techniques that I think we can implement right away into our lives. So I love it. Thank you again for coming on the show. Before we wrap up, I would love for you again to share your website, your Instagram, anywhere that people can reach you that is best if they want to dig into this a little bit more with you and get some more information.
Yeah, it's edlaprevette.com, and I'm on Instagram at 180 underscore Edla Prevette and on Facebook at 180 with Edla Prevette. So I'm Edla Prevette. It's pretty easy to find me once you spell my name. So, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, and we'll talk more soon.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.